A McDonald's delivery driver walked into the White House, stood beside the President of the United States at a press podium, and in that same moment, the U.S. Navy was blockading Iranian ports. That is not a scene from a political satire. That happened. On Monday, a woman driving for Uber Eats arrived expecting to hand off a bag to a security guard. Instead, the door opened. Donald Trump was standing there. He asked her name. He asked what she did for a living. He handed her $100. And while a naval blockade he had personally authorized was going live, he invited her to take questions from the press. Multiple journalists confirmed she walked in and stood at that podium. And simultaneously, according to the New York Times, Iran had already sent 2 separate secret proposals through back channels. What those proposals said will completely change how you see where this conflict is going. Because here is the truth no one is saying clearly. This does not look like a situation anyone is prepared to win. It looks like a situation everyone is desperate to exit. The naval blockade of Iranian ports went into effect Monday morning. U.S. Central Command confirmed it. And within hours, 4 serious problems materialized simultaneously. Problem 1, the legal question. According to Responsible Statecraft, a journal read by senior American foreign policy figures, the blockade as currently structured sits in deeply uncomfortable territory under international maritime law. The U.S. has not formally declared war on Iran. Legal scholars cited in that piece argue the blockade's legitimacy is contestable, and that gives every country that wants to challenge it a legitimate argument to stand behind. Problem 2 arrived from Beijing. China publicly rejected the blockade, stating it has active trade relationships and energy supply agreements routed through the Strait of Hormuz and does not recognize Washington's authority to interfere with them. That statement immediately raised the question no one in the Pentagon has a clean answer to. What happens the day a Chinese naval escort accompanies an Iranian oil tanker through the strait? Does the U.S. fire on a Chinese military vessel? Does it stand aside? Both options carry catastrophic consequences in entirely different directions. Problem 3 came from Riyadh. According to the Wall Street Journal, confirmed by the New Arab, Saudi Arabia applied direct pressure on Washington to quietly walk back the blockade. Not because Riyadh sympathizes with Tehran, because Saudi Arabia is genuinely terrified of what Iran will do in response if the blockade starts strangling Iranian oil revenues. And what Saudi officials warned about specifically was the Houthis and the Strait of Bab al-Mandeb. Problem 4 is Iran's shadow fleet, older tankers that transit without broadcasting their position, difficult to track by satellite. Iranian state media claimed some had already moved through Hormuz undetected. Whether those claims are accurate or propaganda, the shadow fleet concept is real. Russia operated one throughout the Ukraine war. Iran has built one. A blockade that can be broken by vessels running dark at night is a fundamentally different strategic reality than a sealed perimeter. What made Saudi Arabia's warning different from standard diplomatic noise was the level of detail it reportedly contained. According to Wall Street Journal sourcing, Saudi officials told American counterparts that Iran's foreign minister had personally contacted his Saudi counterpart with 2 messages delivered simultaneously. First, Iran wants to negotiate and is prepared to be flexible. Second, if the blockade genuinely begins cutting into Iranian oil revenues, the Houthis will activate and Bab al-Mandeb will close. This was not a threat delivered through a mid-level IRGC spokesperson. This was a foreign minister to a foreign minister, and Saudi Arabia judged it credible enough to relay immediately to Washington as a serious warning. For Riyadh, this is not abstract. The kingdom's east-west pipeline, which bypasses Hormuz by routing crude from eastern oil fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, had already been struck earlier in the conflict by suspected Iranian projectiles. According to the New Arab, Saudi Arabia announced Monday it had returned that pipeline to full capacity of 7 million barrels per day after emergency repairs. That infrastructure is now Saudi Arabia's primary export route. If the Houthis close Bab al-Mandeb and specifically target Yanbu, which Saudi officials warned was mentioned explicitly, Riyadh loses its Hormuz bypass at the exact moment Hormuz itself is contested. That scenario does not simply hurt Iran, it detonates the Gulf economy entirely. The last sustained American military campaign against Houthi infrastructure cost more than $1 billion. Washington's own assessment concluded it produced minimal lasting results. The Houthis shot down American drones and came close to bringing down fighter aircraft. A renewed Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, backed by an Iran with nothing left to lose diplomatically, is not something the U.S. Navy resolves in a week. And yet, while all of this was escalating publicly, something entirely different was happening behind closed doors. Iran was not just threatening, Iran was offering. The New York Times reported this week, citing 2 senior Iranian officials and 1 American official, exactly what transpired in Islamabad when J.D. Vance led the American delegation. The American side presented a core demand: halt all uranium enrichment for 20 years and remove the existing stockpile of 450 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60%, both conditions non-negotiable. Iran's delegation responded with a counteroffer. They proposed suspending uranium enrichment for 5 years. And on the stockpile question, rather than physically shipping enriched material out of the country, which Tehran had already rejected as a sovereignty violation, Iran offered to dilute it, reduce the 60% concentration to a level far below what a weapon requires while keeping it on Iranian soil. Vance rejected the 5-year proposal. He restated the American position: 20 years, not 5. Iran said no. At 6:30 in the morning in a Pakistani hotel lobby, the talks ended. But here is what almost no one reported from the New York Times analysis. When Vance brought the Islamabad outcome back to Trump, the president reportedly did not embrace the 20-year counteroffer as his final position either. Trump's actual preference, according to the paper's sourcing, is closer to what he has described publicly: a complete and permanent halt to Iranian enrichment. Not 20 years, not a temporary arrangement with a sunset clause. Zero enrichment on Iranian soil, indefinitely. That gap between Iran's 5-year proposal and Trump's permanent demand is enormous. But the fact that both sides are now negotiating over time periods, rather than over whether enrichment continues at all, represents a genuine shift from where things stood before the 12-day war began. And 3 countries are working around the clock to close that gap. According to Axios, confirmed by multiple regional outlets, Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan are actively carrying messages between Washington and Tehran. Turkey has formal diplomatic ties with both governments and previously hosted nuclear discussions. Egypt controls the Suez Canal and has massive economic exposure. Every week, Hormuz stays restricted. Cairo loses tens of millions of dollars in canal revenues. Pakistan hosted the Islamabad talks and has offered to host again. And the Associated Press confirmed a new round of direct talks between American and Iranian officials has been set for Thursday. The location has not been publicly announced. Pakistan offered again. Indications suggest the U.S. prefers a different venue, possibly Istanbul or Cairo. That Thursday meeting, if it holds, is the most consequential diplomatic event of the coming week, because both sides are sending signals that suggest they are closer to a framework than their public posturing indicates. Iran has reportedly shown flexibility it has never shown before. Offering to pause enrichment for any defined period was previously a hard line Tehran refused to cross publicly. Putting a 5-year pause on the table in Islamabad, and since reportedly signaling willingness to discuss 15 or even 20 years, represents a genuine shift driven by the economic and military damage Iran absorbed during 40 days of conflict. The question is whether Trump will recognize a deal when he sees one. And to understand why that question is genuinely uncertain, you need to understand what happened the last time America had a nuclear agreement with Iran. Barack Obama's JCPOA was assessed by most arms control experts as a significant non-proliferation achievement. It rolled back Iran's enrichment capacity, capped its stockpile, and kept Iran further from a weapon than North Korea has ever been. It had a sunset clause, key provisions set to expire around 2030. Trump withdrew from it in 2018. His stated reason was always the sunset clause. The idea that Iran was being given a delayed green light to resume full enrichment once the agreement lapsed. What Trump is seeking now is qualitatively different from anything any prior American administration has demanded. He is not asking Iran to limit enrichment. He is asking Iran to permanently exit the enrichment business, to become a country that imports nuclear fuel rather than producing it. The comparison analysts keep returning to is Libya in 2003. Muammar Gaddafi agreed to full disarmament in exchange for sanctions relief and diplomatic normalization. 8 years later, NATO helped overthrow him. Iranian officials are not unaware of that sequence. The Libya model is not a selling point in Tehran. It is a cautionary tale cited by every Iranian official whenever permanent disarmament comes up. And yet the signals emerging ahead of Thursday suggest Iran's position is softening in ways that would have been unthinkable before the war began. The question now is what America is willing to offer in return. Lifting sanctions, all of them, comprehensively, is reportedly on the table. That offer, if it materializes, would represent hundreds of billions of dollars to an Iranian economy that Tehran's own finance ministry publicly estimated suffered $270 billion in direct war damages over 40 days. Now consider Israel's position. Israel's finance ministry released preliminary war cost figures this week. Approximately $11.5 billion in budgetary expenditure during the 40-day conflict. Israel's pre-war budget allocation for the entire Iran war scenario was approximately $12.5 billion. Israel consumed somewhere between 92 and 98% of that contingency fund in 40 days, before accounting for the separate ongoing Lebanon front, which has run to approximately $9 billion on its own. Israel's finance minister, in a statement Haaretz described as unusually candid for a government official during an active conflict, said the financial consequences of resuming the war at the same intensity would be, in his words, catastrophic. The Knesset had already approved a supplemental defense budget of record size, $45.8 billion for the full year. The pace at which the Iran conflict burned through resources makes even that figure look potentially insufficient if hostilities restart. There is a tactical dimension that may be even more alarming. According to Haaretz, Israel's missile interception rate against Iranian ballistic missiles degraded significantly during the 40 days. The initial rate, when Iron Dome and its companion layers were at full operational readiness, was approximately 95%. 1 in 20 Iranian missiles reached its target. By the end of the conflict, that rate had dropped to approximately 73%. Roughly 1 in 4 missiles was getting through. Iran fired 650 ballistic missiles at Israel during the conflict. At the degraded rate, the mathematical trajectory points toward a situation where the majority of incoming missiles would reach Israeli territory. One country has spent these 6 weeks quietly benefiting from everything described above: Russia. Global oil at $103 per barrel is extraordinarily profitable for an economy whose primary export is hydrocarbons. Every week, Hormuz stays restricted, Russian revenues climb. The numbers are significant. Russian oil export income has increased by billions per month compared to pre-conflict baseline figures, because Gulf market disruption has pushed prices to levels that make even heavily discounted Russian crude extremely profitable. The second-order consequence European governments are beginning to discuss openly: a Russia that exits this period financially stronger, with repaired state revenues, rebuilt military equipment stocks, and a re-energized defense industrial base, is a Russia that re-enters the Ukraine conflict in a fundamentally different position than it held when the ceasefire took hold. European analysts, according to the Financial Times and recent European parliamentary debates, are increasingly concerned the Iran conflict has inadvertently created conditions for a more dangerous Russian return to Ukraine, one fought with deeper reserves and fewer economic constraints than the last phase. That is not a Middle Eastern problem. It is a European security problem developing in real time. Here is where the evidence actually points. Iran is more economically damaged than at any point in its modern history. Its nuclear infrastructure has been significantly degraded. Its political leadership conducts diplomacy through back channels while publicly threatening escalation. America has imposed a blockade facing 4 simultaneous structural challenges, with no meaningful allied coalition behind it. Israel has consumed 98% of its Iran war budget in 40 days, is watching interception rates decline, and has a finance minister telling the cabinet privately that resumption would be catastrophic. Saudi Arabia is begging Washington to de-escalate before Houthi action destroys the kingdom's only functioning oil export route. And Thursday, somewhere in a room whose location has not yet been named publicly, American and Iranian officials are scheduled to sit across a table from each other and try again. The signals, the back channels, the revised offers, the financial exhaustion on all sides, the Saudi pressure, the quiet European fear about Russia, all point in one direction. Not toward peace, necessarily. Toward a deal both sides can barely live with. The kind of deal that gets signed not because anyone is satisfied, but because the alternative has become too expensive for everyone involved. The wild card is the one thing deals cannot account for, an incident no one plans and no one controls. A shadow tanker that gets fired on, a Houthi missile that strikes the wrong target, a moment where the performance ends and the machinery of war restarts before anyone can stop it. If this breakdown of the evidence matters to you, hit like right now and make sure you are subscribed to Global Conflict Feed. Thursday is coming fast. Whatever happens in that room will determine whether the next chapter is written with diplomats or with destroyers. This is not the behavior of a country that believes it can win a second round.